Affordable Housing Committee to order. I will read a statement and then ask for someone to make a motion. In accordance with Governor Lee's Executive Order number 16, extended by Executive Orders number 34 and 51, because the items on the meeting agenda constitute essential business of this body and meeting electronically is necessary to protect the health, safety, and welfare of Tennesseans in light of the COVID-19 outbreak, make a motion that we meet electronically. Is there a motion to that effect?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, we are meeting electronically. Thank you for being here. Mr. Cooper, since this is a called meeting, do we still need to do a roll call?
The committee will not be taking action tonight, right?
No, we are just working on a bill.
Okay, then no roll call is necessary.
Okay, all right, I'm going to take note of who's made it, but appreciate all the committee members that are here and also other interested council members for coming. The purpose of this meeting is specifically to speak about proposed BL 2022-24. Make sure I said that right. Sponsored by Councilmember Brandon Taylor, which he was kind enough to defer so that we would have this opportunity to receive input and discuss it amongst ourselves and possibly make some changes so that we can make sure that it does what it is intended to do. I will turn it over to Councilmember Taylor and let you talk about what your goal is, and then I will recognize other council members who have raised their hand and asked to speak. And also stakeholders are welcome to participate in this conversation. Just hit your raise your hand button and I'll recognize people in order if I can keep track of it. And then if there are some people who are only here as attendees, we'll need to know who you are so that we can get you moved over to panelists. And Mr. Hurd, if you can let me know if you need more information to do that, I will try to get that information for you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Taylor to give your intro and tell us how you'd like to.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to keep this as brief as I can so we can have some great conversation. As we move forward, this bill, BL 2022-24, was introduced actually in March, and we made a substitute on July 7th. But this bill was introduced in an opportunity to share with residents that are tenants of rental property information that the property may be sold, have an intent to sell. Currently, at the moment, we've discussed a minimum of 90 days written notice to the resident, and that allowing the landlord to create their own messaging in that letter. I've had some conversations with a few interested parties and have discussed some of those, and had a chance to discuss some of those thoughts that they have. And we have been working actually here, actually even over the weekend, to make this much more of a bill that fits all parties involved, from the tenants all the way to the landlords and the realtors. And we want to make sure that we have the intent that is heard that's correctly. And that is, number one, to provide notice that the property has an intent to sell. Councilmember Hauser has added an amendment to this, is where we had that substitute, which was some housekeeping, an amendment to add a 5 days of a binding sale agreement to the closing date. And the tenant then must have an additional time for that notice. The overall goal, again, for me is to have some awareness for the tenant to understand kind of what's going on the back end of the property that they call home, And this bill here can gives an opportunity for them to know, to have that awareness, and to receive a notice. And again, I think I spoke with Greater Nashville Realtors Group, and one of the main concerns was that this is just a notice. We're not asking you to say or to message the information in a certain way, but to create a notice with the time that have been asked in the bill to notice that the tenant notice to the tenant that the property has an intent to be sold. So, Councilmember Allen, I'm going to let you move forward so we can have some discussion in more detail as we move through this bill.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Let me just back up and dig a little deeper, if I might, into why this information about the sale is important to the tenant. Can you unpack that for us a little bit more?
Thank you, Councilmember Allen. Yes. So currently, right now, there is not there's not a law to require any notice. Even there's not even law to share that the property has been sold. And so the main goal is to add some protections for the tenant within the awareness. If the property has been sold, and we have some, for instance, there. Some examples of properties that have been sold and tenants have been requested to leave thereafter. The Tennessee law states that if it's a week-to-week rental, you have 10 days. If to ask the tenant to leave, it's month-to-month, you have 30 days. And then if there's a lease, the lease will then transfer over to the new owner. But we've had properties just do that, where there was a lease that was transferred over to the owner. And then the tenants were asked to leave to create a Airbnb hotel. We've had tenants that were on month-to-month lease that were, again, asked to leave, not knowing that the property was going to be sold. They were asked to leave by someone that they've never met and never had conversations with. So this adds some knowledge that the property is indeed has an intent to be sold, and that the tenant will then have awareness that the property may be switching hands.
Okay, thank you for that. I will take a few questions, and then I may throw in some comments as well. Councilmember Suara.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's not a question because I'm a co-sponsor of the bill, but I just want to add a little to what Councilmember Taylor said. When people have to leave, what we have to bear in mind also is that there could be a need for them to change schools for their kids. It could have an impact on their jobs. And so without adequate notice, it's causing undue hardship on families, because now the kid is now zoned to another school, or they have to move, or they have to find special situations to stay, and all of that. And so just enough notice. I've had some conversation, and people were like, no, they have a recourse with the new owner, or they should go with the owner. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. And sometimes people don't always know their rights. That is a fact, which we can do with education. But we're thinking here that I've had some other conversation about maybe it's not when it's being sold, but intends to sell. And so I'm open with this conversation today, knowing that we're trying to protect people, knowing that we have actual cases of people that it's happened to, that we're able to come to a place where we can do something with the bill where it protects the tenant without undue hardship on the landlord. But if there's a way to give some notice of intent to sell, or some kind of notice, so people can start planning their lives in terms of where would they move to, what happened to their kids, how do they deal with their jobs, so we don't cause undue hardship. The economy is now where people might be putting up their homes for sale, the turnaround for sale might be going on, and we just don't want all of this to add to what is happening with tenants. So I wanted to put that in, that it's not just about living and finding a place. Living and finding a place impacts a lot of things, including children too. So just wanted to put that there as we continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate that. So I guess, and I guess the point that I want to make sure that we're clear on is what seems to be causing the hardship is when an owner decides to terminate a lease and there is not enough notification for a person to find a place to live because of the hardships of changing schools or changing jobs or simply not being able to find another place with regard to that. We, as you all know, got a fair amount of feedback on this bill from the folks on the owner side of this, and that was why Councilmember Taylor was gracious enough to delay this to work on input that would help inform us to make sure that we're accomplishing the goal that we're trying to accomplish. And I had sent out to, at least to the committee members, sort of my stumbling and bumbling non-lawyerly summary of what the Uniform Landlord and Rental Tenant Act provides, and Councilmember Taylor alluded to that briefly. And that, just in terms of what kind of notice is currently required by law, is, if I understand this right, and I would welcome any lawyer in the conversation to jump in and correct me or to elaborate on anything that I'm saying. As I understand it, the URLTA, which is Tennessee state law, does not allow anyone to terminate a lease early unless there's a reason. And those reasons could be if there's an act of violence or an abandonment or non-payment of rent. But an owner can't just simply decide that they want to end a lease early. That's my understanding. And I have heard from, again, people in the industry that even if the property is sold, a new owner buys that lease and still can't end the lease early. And I have heard that from enough people that if there's a lawyer in the group who wants to correct me on that, I'm open to input. Mr. Cooper?
Councilmember, you are correct.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's important for us to know. So it sounds like what we're dealing with here, or at least the issues that are causing concern, are when someone thinks that they are going to be able to stay in a place, and because of a change of ownership, suddenly they are not able to stay for the amount of time that they thought, and they have to quickly find a new place to live. So what I'm trying to think my way through is, can we solve that problem, and is the sale of the property actually what we need to be attacking, or is it a notification about when the lease ends, or is it better enforcement on not honoring a contract that is supposed to be out there? So I mean, I just throw that question out there as as one item that I think needs to be taken into account as we talk about the options. And I see that you're going forward. Kate, would you like to speak?
Yes. It's my understanding also that when it comes to new owners, standard leases, and I'm familiar with them, it's an organization I worked with previously, used them. There are usually clauses in there that state, and this has been the problem, the new owners take over and then they send out a notice saying effective after 30 days or whatever period they give, the rent is going to increase. And it's usually much more than they've been paying, and so then they're struggling.
Gotcha.
They're struggling. So that's part of the problem is that the rent increase is much more, and it puts a burden on. So then they're scrambling to either find the funds to pay it and be burdened, or find another place to live.
Gotcha. That's an excellent point. Let me ask any of the lawyers in the room. I would think that if you have a lease that has a set term in it, that you can't change the terms of payment until that lease is up for renewal. Is that correct? Mr. Cooper?
Council Lady, this is John. I think it would depend on the terms of the lease and what the rent increase provisions within the agreement are. But assuming it's silent as to that, then yes, that would be correct.
Gotcha. So then two issues that we're looking at. One is having to leave earlier than you had expected, or having to suddenly pay more rent than you had expected based on what you thought you had signed in the lease. Increase in rent, that requires 90 days notice according to the law that we just passed.
Right.
So what we just passed back in January, Councilmember Toombs' law said that if it's not already written into the lease, that we would require 60 days notice. So that was an important issue that Councilmember Toombs worked with the industry on, and that we hope that we have provided some relief on that piece of it. And thank you for raising that issue, Kay.
Councilwoman Allen, so when you say if it's not already written into the lease, what does that mean?
If your lease says we will give you 60 days or 90 days or 30 days notice before we raise your rent, then you're bound by that. But if your lease is silent, there is now a Metro law that says anyone who didn't think of that ahead of time has to give 60 days notice now.
Okay.
And that gets us back to an education issue, which I want us to circle back around to, is how do we let people know that they now have this protection? And I think that's another discussion that I think we need to have, both about the rent increase and about the termination of the lease or the sale of the property, or whatever we end up deciding is solving the problem that we are trying to avoid. So, but I think that's an important issue, and that one is one that we have begun to address, thanks to BL 2020-149. So, Councilmember Taylor.
Thank you. So one thing I did want to note, Councilmember Allen, is that when it comes to the sale, and forgive me, I'm using a new. So if I cut in and out, I'm using the new hold your space bar. I just wanted to see how this works, so we could be better prepared. So, so we're not asking anything. So this is. Right now, I think some of the discussion that we're having are discussions in regards to after a new owner takes the lease, or a new owner takes they own the property, right? And so my goal with this bill is not necessarily for a new owner. My goal for this bill is to provide opportunities before the new owner takes the lease. The lease could be up in 30 days after, or the lease could be ended and you don't have a renewal lease. So there's a few implications there that, we can make some assumptions, but there are a few implications there where the tenant does not know what the future of their home will be.
Thank you for that comment. You did a good job of taking everything down. So again, the issue is providing the tenant with assurance that they know what rent they're paying, that they know that they will be able to continue to live there, and that the owner will continue to treat them as their lease is specified that they will be treated. I know that there had been some some suggestions of possible other language. Two versions that I have seen. One was presented by Leneva Head that talked about sharing some of the splitting the distance between the time, and Katie Lynn Bailey had made some suggestions about a similar statement to what we did on the raising of the rent, that if it's not already written into the clause, that we require a 60 or 90-day notice of any change or non-renewal of the lease, since you can't legally rent them early. I would love to hear some discussion on those two options. Councilmember Taylor.
Yes, so we had a great conversation with the realtors, and I've had a chance to talk to Ms. Lane Bailey as well. One of the things that we did notice is the length of time for the notice. One specifically that actually did catch my attention that could cause harm is a hardship. So any individual that may have a hardship and they need to sell quickly, 90 days doesn't give them that opportunity to do so. So looking at the date, and of course also adding a clause within if it's added into the lease, that gives some protections, but yet still if you add that we don't have to tell you in the lease, that doesn't fit the intent that we're looking for as well.
Gotcha. Okay. So possibly an option for a hardship if someone needed to sell quickly. Okay, and I have Leneva Head, who is a reference that Councilmember Hauser, who I think is dealing with some other issues and can't be with us, but had requested her input. So I'll recognize Ms. Head as well.
Hi.
Yeah, there you are.
So the suggestion that I was making, I didn't know how much detail you wanted, but the suggestion, one of the ways I thought we could solve the problem is by plugging in a timeline. So once they get their agreement in place, they're now at that point would be obligated to give a notice to the tenant that this property is being sold. So that's just a notice, like you were mentioning earlier, as far as the Association of Realtors confirming, this is just a notice saying this is our intent to sell. We are now under contract. This property is going to change ownership. So that's part one of it. The second part is building in a window of time to close. So if they close between 45 to 51 days after that contract date, that binding agreement date, when all terms have been agreed to, then that will allow time to close on the deal and give a tenant that 30-day notice post-closing that they've got to vacate. And I say post-closing because the new owner may actually want the tenant to stay. This is a situation that's mainly going to be impacting people who are on month-to-month leases. This is not something that's going to impact people who are in an annual lease or in a bound lease agreement. These are mostly people who are already on month-to-month because all they're required is a 30-day notice. So that was one of the concepts that I had put forward to simplify the process.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Good to have options. And you raise a really good point, which is, in general, most leases, if you're on an annual lease, have typically a 60 to 90 day notice built in already, but not all. And that may be another way we want to attack this. But is there a way to provide additional protection to people on a month-to-month lease? And that may be a special piece of this that we might want to come back and talk about. So I appreciate those options on that. I'm looking for other hands up. Okay, at the moment, which I don't see. Councilmember Nash.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for letting me join you today. A couple of issues. The bill currently requires a 90-day notice. Oops, sorry. A 90-day notice that you are listing the property. And I have one little piece of rental property that I inherited from my son, and I am constantly getting letters and phone calls from people who want to give me a cash offer for the duplex. So a lot of times, some of these sales aren't going to be listed. And then I wonder if we might want to think about for the person who owns one or two pieces of rental property, they're just a small landowner. It's a small business for them. I wonder if we might want to maybe look at, it seems to be more of a problem if it's a big apartment complex or something, maybe put a number of units kind of clause in here. If you're selling more than 20 units or something like that, it might have a better, really aim at the problem people, the big corporations buying out places instead of the home here, home there. Just a thought.
Yeah, I appreciate that thought. I would be interested to know if anyone in the Bring has data on where this problem occurs. Is it more with the mom and pops who don't have the standard contract, or is it with the larger apartments that are being bought by out-of-town interest, or are those the ones who, tend to have the more sophisticated contracts, and so they're stuck with, or they've already written in a lease that requires them to provide the 60 to 90-day notice that's in many of the standard leases. And I would welcome anyone who can provide data on which of those, if there is a good reason to making a distinction between those, and if so, is the problem more prevalent in one category or the other? All right,
Lady Ellen.
Yeah, let me recognize Russ Oldham, and then I'll come back to you, Kay.
Thanks.
Russ Oldham.
Hey, Berkeley, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. If you'll tell folks who you are and who you're with.
Yeah, my name is Russ Oldham. I work for CVRE. We are advisors to real estate transactions. So we help primarily commercial owners, the larger owners that buy and sell apartment complexes. And so we've participated in hundreds of these transactions over the years. So one thing I do want to point out, I think the intent of this is fantastic, and I totally agree, and I would support any, successful effort in addressing the language at the lease level. But I just want to reiterate that in 99 times out of 100, and I could probably provide that data if given some time, the new owner is buying the property because they want the residents to stay. And so by creating this disruption, I think it's going to create a lot of strain on the property. Residents are going to maybe assume the worst, that they're going to be asked to leave, and it's going to stress them out. They're going to incur moving costs. Their kids may have to change school zones, when in fact the new owner just wants them to stay, and they're going to honor the lease that's in place, like it's already been said. And so it's kind of the throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think the vast majority of issues, the new owners want residents to stay. And in fact, if they give notice 90 days ahead of time and 10% or 15% of the residents freak out and leave, then they can't buy the transaction. The lender won't lend on it because now the revenue is coming in lower, and it's going to create a lot of disruption in the transaction industry and hurt values. I think hurt residents at the end. At the end of the day, the new owner, if they step into a lease that the prior owner signed, and that lease says that resident has 10 months until that lease expires, they cannot change that lease. And so the month-to-month issue is a problem, and I don't have a great solution to that. If someone steps in and one of their residents only has 30 days, then they are legally allowed to give that resident notice, and it'll only be 30 days. But the reality of it is all these large investors who own these buildings, they're always considering selling. So they're on January 1st, they're going to send in a notice and say, hey, we might sell. And it's not really going to do anything at the end of the day. And so it's just going to create a lot of, I think, liability for a lot of parties. There's title insurance issues, there's lending issues, and at the end of the day, the root issue is tenants should have enough notice before they're asked to non-renew a lease, and this does not address that at all.
Thanks for that viewpoint. And if you could provide some data on how many people buy rental property and then keep the tenants, that would be very helpful. I think if you could. This isn't coming back for another couple of weeks. I believe Councilmember Taylor, isn't this coming back in September?
That's correct.
Correct. So we've got some time. If you could provide us with some of that data, that would be very, very helpful, actually.
That'd be great. I just want to point out one other thing. In these larger buildings, there may be 400 units. There may be 700 residents in there. So the efficacy of actually giving notice to 600 or 700 people, how do you confirm that they got notice? How do the lawyers get comfortable that they were noticed? It's just a mountain of paperwork, and it's only going to add cost to the owner, which unfortunately they're then going to try to recover from tenants. And it really doesn't fix the problem. And so, but back to your question, I'd be happy to try to put together some data on at least the transactions we've been involved with, how many have resulted in, in some cases there's older buildings and the landlord wants to renovate it, and they're going to renovate it once those leases roll over, but they can't go in there and just terminate the leases. But I'll put together whatever data I can and try to help.
Okay. And then if they're going to raise rents, we've covered that already with the other notification. So that's important to be aware of as well. Kay Bowers, thank you for waiting. I think that was Kay that wanted to speak next. Was that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
On my screen, I don't, yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Oh, actually, no, I can't hear you.
How about now?
Yeah, now you're good.
Can you hear me?
No.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
I would raise my hand, but I don't see the icon on my screen to raise your hand, so I can't do that. I apologize.
Okay.
I think one of the obvious challenges is trying to create a vanilla approach for everything. And I know after the tornado in North Nashville, and Councilman Taylor can speak to this, there have been instances where people have been told by the owners, that they're going to have to leave, that they're not going to continue to renew, and the property goes up. And it is a real challenge for some of our populations that don't know how to navigate these circumstances.
Right.
They just don't know. In some cities across the country, have put these sort of mechanisms in place, but they are targeted towards properties that are affordable housing properties, where they require a kind of notice, like Minneapolis has done this recently. And it comes down to preserving housing that's is there for those at the lower income levels. So therein lies the challenge, is trying to create one bill to cover all circumstances, and that's impossible. So when you go back and forth, it gets all watered down, and then does it even make sense at all? But I think that's the challenge that lies before everyone that's concerned about this. It's not necessarily people that are living in properties with, that have the ability to pay higher rents and incomes that they can do that. It's all the other, it's the workforce. The ones making $35,000 a year and below. Those are the ones that really have the challenges when they have to move quickly.
Gotcha. That makes good sense. Thank you. See, Scott Troxel.
Yes. Thanks, Councilman Allen.
Introduce yourself and say who you're with.
Sure. I'm Scott Troxel. I'm a residential realtor with Keller Williams. I was the president of Greater Nashville Realtors in 2017 and the current chair of the legislative committee. And thank you for the opportunity to talk and have a nice conversation with Councilman Taylor Thursday last week. My experience is essentially in residential sales and not in large scale multifamily rental properties. Most of my experience is single family duplexes or triplexes. And I agree with the gentleman that spoke earlier from CBRE that whenever you introduce doubt or instability into the situation, in a 90-day notice is certainly going to do that. The tenant usually moves towards anxiety because they know their current landlord, they don't know the new landlord, and they don't know what the intentions are of the new landlord. And a lot of times they will actually basically move out, even if there's a penalty, because they'll move more towards certainty, something they know. And so part of my experience is that providing a substantial notice like this is actually going to work against the process, whether it's for the tenant themselves or for the owner of the property. And part of my sense is that I understand the concern and the situations that have created the impetus for this bill. My sense of this situation is that it's essentially rogue landlords who aren't concerned about the law or ignorant of the law, who have created most of the challenges, at least in the smaller scale properties. And I think if the law changes, they're not going to suddenly start behaving. And so I think that the ordinance as proposed makes it much more difficult and unwieldy, both for the sale of the property, but also dealing with the tenant. And I think it can ultimately have a negative impact on the tenant, certainly a negative impact on the landlord, and make the properties less sellable.
Thank you. I appreciate that insight, your perspective from the smaller property. Councilmember Suara, is that a new request to speak?
Yes, ma'am.
Great, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm listening to the conversation from the two gentlemen that spoke. I think one of the reasons why we kept pushing this back, and I had a conversation with John Dodson with the Greater Nashville Realtor too, is that we know there is a problem. Whether it's a few bad apple, but we do know that. We had an email that was sent to the entire council by a student, a medical student at Vanderbilt, whose property was sold and she was not given enough notice. So we know this is happening. What we've asked for is that we're asking for assistance and what is the best way to change this? How do we make it work for everybody? Because we don't want to put undue hardship on the landlord. We don't want to put it on the bigger property. That's not what we're trying to do here. But we do recognize that there are people out there that are doing things that are putting our residents in that situation. That's why the sponsor keep pushing it back to say, let's work together on a language that works for all of us. So what I will ask for everyone that is in opposition is that, just like Ms. Ed did, is how do we change this? That's, I think somebody had told me that maybe not when it's listed, maybe at the point of the agreement. Yes, let's talk about how do we fix this, because everybody realized the intent. Everybody says they understand and that it's good. So if it's good and it's protected, how do we make sure that we do that? And so I think that's the essence of the conversation. And if everybody can come up with suggestion on, I think if you do this, then you can protect the people you need to protect without exposing others. I hope that's where this conversation will go, because I don't want to drop it completely, because we all said there is a need for it. That's what I'm hearing. But we don't want you to negatively impact others. So let's work together to come up with a language that can do that.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point. And again, I believe the letter from the Vanderbilt student, the hardship was not that there was a new owner. The hardship was that the new owner asked her to leave. Is that correct?
Yes, I'll admit myself. Yes, that was the hardship. The new owner asked her to leave and did not give her enough time. And so people are facing these things, in different scenarios. So how do we make sure that we do something that protects, the language that works for most, if not for all? Thank you.
And I think Mr. Troxel raised a good point, which I've also heard from a few other people, is that the road landlords, perhaps if there's a way to put some teeth in whatever we do, that may get their attention better than simply a new law that has similar teeth to what is already out there. And I have seen, as I said, a suggestion from his head, which I appreciate, and another one from, I'm not sure which organization it was, that again, worked similarly to Councilmember Toombs' bill that said if there's not already written into the lease an appropriate notification clause, then it defaults to what we're saying. And I guess the question I would ask is, would a clause like that says if your lease does not specifically say 60 to 90 days before your lease is set to end, there will be notification of either non-renewal of the lease or intent to renew. And if that's not written into your lease, then Metro law will now say that it defaults to 90 days. And to put some teeth into it, if a landlord does not abide by that, then the maximum fine is $50. But if it's $50 a unit, that could be a noticeable amount of money for a 200-unit apartment building. That's a suggestion that I've heard that to me is similar to the solution that we came up with on the raising of the rent, but perhaps the addition of a penalty, and even if we can talk about some education opportunities to be sure that tenants are aware of their rights, that could further make it more effective. So I throw those thoughts out there. Ms. Head, your hand is still up, and I'm not sure if that's a new request to speak or not. Do you have, is that a new request to speak on your part? No, okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Okay, great. You're recognized. Thank you.
Thank you. So as the owner of Welcome Home Realty, I have been in real estate for about 20 years. And I also do property management, not with the large apartment complexes, but I do residential and commercial sales and leasing and property management. And so I just wanted to touch on very quickly, I think it's going to be great if we focus on and remember that this is about the month-to-month people. So when you're dealing with a large conglomerate, a large apartment complex, a notice to non-renew for any tenant, if you're on a month-to-month, is not really applicable.
Gotcha.
They're on a month-to-month basis. So that's 30 days, 30 days, 30 days. So the notice to non-renew won't really help them. Mm-hmm. It will help anyone whose lease is getting ready to terminate. So if you've got a large complex going through the sales process, you're letting your tenants know, hey, this property is about to change ownership. That doesn't mean everybody's lease is about to be canceled, everybody's rent's about to be raised, head for the hills. It just means it's no longer going to be owned by Leneva Head, it's going to be owned by Scott Thompson. And go from there. I do believe, without creating an undue hardship on any of the owners, large or small, I think that in the technology that we're in, a lot of the leases now have language that allows you to send notices via email, not just by mail or stick it on the door. But if you have an electronic ability, create a letter, send it out to the masses. You can pull the rent roll, and you can see who the people are that are rolling off. Their leases are either ending or they're on month to month. So you don't have to notify the entire complex. if you navigate it that way, you could notify the people. It could be specific to the people who are rolling off of their leases or who are on month-to-month leases. There could be some phrasing or wording that addresses it that way. That creates less of a hardship on those who have hundreds of units.
Right.
It is important because in our city, and I'm a native Nashvilleian, so I've been through the tornadoes of 1998, and I've been through all of that, and I've watched. Once we have some type of major trauma in this city, it is a free-for-all for opportunity. And in that opportunity, that's where the abuses come in, which is why this is part of the reason why this is so important, because those opportunities are going to happen again. So what do we do in preparation for that? I don't think that a large entity or a smaller entity is going to withstand some grand hardship by just saying, hey, this is what's going on, by way of how many tenants head for the hills. If they're still in a lease, they're not going anywhere if the lease is up anyway. But I think it's important that the data that you requested be provided to actually truly see the real impact. So when this decision gets made, it's made on real information and not just speculation on how everyone's going to respond when we really don't know. I have had times when properties have changed ownership and the people are clear they want to stay. The owner is clear they want them to stay. The new person is clear that they want them to stay. So people don't run and they don't like moving. So they're not going to just move just because you say you're selling the property. What's going to make them move is when you let them know that they can no longer afford that property and they got to leave, and you don't give them any notice, or you purchase the property with full intent to move in and not even have them occupy the space.
Thank you. But lots of excellent points there. And I mean, I think the suggestion to treat the month-to-month separately or differently, or to carve out something specific for that, I think is a wise one. And I would ask if you have data as well on your experiences with transfer of property, that would be helpful to us. Sure. Also, so that'd be great. The more
Madam Chair.
Councilmember Taylor.
Okay, Madam Chair, thank you.
Yes, sir.
So with data, I'm working to get data from Metro Social Services and a few other areas. Great. So, so I do want to let you know that we'll have more data coming.
Great.
The 2020, or not the 2020 census, but the 2010 census numbers are kind of, or excuse me, the 2018 numbers are coming in regards to housing data, and once we receive everything, we'll be able to create some documents to share. There's a few things. One of the big things, and it's with data, you know, a lot of times people have anxiety when they're told that the property is going to be sold. I think Mr. Troxel mentioned that. Right now, we're not telling people that property is going to be sold. So I'm not sure if we could create data or find data on an anxiety level if people are being told. You know, that I'm not sure how that statement will go well as we create this legislation. But when it comes to anxiety, I think one of the points that I always like to keep in front of me with this legislation is that we're asking to provide notice, not necessarily asking for landlords to provide, or for us to provide landlords with the messaging that they have to share. For instance, if you know the outcome of the sale at some point, and I know right now we're speaking on a 90-day notice, and it may be hard to get that information. But if you do know the outcomes, because I think the first conversation I had with the Greater Apartment Association was that a lot of times you don't have the information, but you will get the information at some point. Sometimes the property management will not change. Sometimes it's just property changing hands. again, for a hardship or for something else. And so in that messaging, I think that is where we have a great opportunity to allow the freedom of the landlord or the property managers to create the messaging that will work best for them to ensure that they don't provide any of that anxiety. When it comes to the rogue landlords, unfortunately, we can't say that you're good or you're bad. When we're looking at legislation, council member, we can only say that this is the law for all people that do X. And so, you know, as we've talked about the bad apples. Yeah, there's bad apples in the bunch, and there are good apples in the bunch. Most of the people on this call, I would say, are good apples. But unfortunately, we can't make that discretion as a body. So therefore, we have to have something that will work to find this intent, which is a notice to the tenants. And I always want to come back. We get way down the hole of this may happen or this may happen. We understand of some of the reasons why we want to put this in place, right? But the goal of this legislation is to provide notice to the tenant that the property has an intent to sell, that the landlord or the property owner has an intent to sell a property with tenants, residential tenants, that is. And I mean, we just watched it actually with commercial tenants just over the other day. There was a news report with Councilmember Johnston working to with the MAPCO. They bought the property, and now they're asking several small businesses to leave shortly after the property's bought. So we're seeing this happen in this city several times. So what we would like to do, and I would like to do with this legislation, and the intent is to provide a notice to if something does happen where you have to leave earlier than you thought, and earlier than you thought may not be at the end of your lease, right? You may be willing to say, oh, I've been here for 15 years. I'm planning to be here another 10 or another 5 or at least another year. And so your end of the lease could be 10 months, 12 months out after this property is being sold, but yet it gives you an opportunity to know that there is a change of hands, and that if you need to prepare for something different to happen with your living situation, you can start to prepare.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Troxel.
Okay. Madam Chair, can I, before Mr. Troxel speak, I have a question for him.
Sure, jump on in.
I wanted to ask Mr. Troxel and anyone on the real estate side. I get the fact that if I get a notice my apartment is about to be sold, I can get nervous. But I think that I'll be nervous about whether the rent was going to go up. I'll be nervous about whether I'm going to have to leave. And that's what that will create. And so if you are creating a notice of intent to sell, would not writing in there as part of, everybody's talking about this education piece, but writing in there that in the process of doing this, but according to the terms, you do not have to leave until your lease expires, and your rent will not be changed until your lease is done. Would that not mitigate that fear or reduce that fear on the part of, is that not something that could be done to be able to simply clean the process? But please know that you have a right to stay until the end of your lease, and your rent will not be changing because ownership is changing. I think that little sentence will allay the fear of somebody like me that is wondering what is going to happen. And that might reduce the fear of that exodus. That's my take or my question or thoughts, and I just want Mr. Troxel to see if that is a workable solution.
Good question, Mr. Troxel.
Well, I think it is. I think it's like whenever I sell a property and it has a tenant in place, it's always a dance. First of all, when I talk with the owner of the property, is it best to wait until the tenant has moved out to the end of the lease? Because there are a lot of rental property that doesn't show very well while the tenant's still present. So the first thing we do is try to figure out the timing of it. Is it best to wait until after there's no tenant of the property? or show it with the tenant still in place. And so part of my objective when I list and sell a property where there's a tenant in place, if the tenant is in place, is I need to communicate very well with them, not just the landlord, but I do, because I need to be a good friend of the tenant, because the tenant can really make things difficult as far as access to the property, showing of the property. And the thing is, I'm asking them to do something that's against their best interest. If they want to stay, it's against their best interest to make it easy for me to see the property and for it to present well. So, communication's a big part of the process. So I think the better you can make the communication, certainly the better. Something I've thought about is like when you close on a property as a buyer and you're getting all the loan terms, they've made a lot of good changes over the last 10 years as far as good faith estimate and just language that the closing attorney has to walk through at closing. We used to call it the truth in lending language. I forget what it's called technically now, but they walk you through your loan is as far as it's a 30-year note, here's your payment, here's your property tax. They walk you through every bit of it. And it would be nice if that kind of communication could take place with the tenant. The challenge is like a lot of property managers are realtors, but not all property managers are realtors. How do you effectively communicate this or distribute this information as far as what needs to be communicated to tenants in a way that either all or most landlords utilize the language? So I think something like that can be helpful. One idea I wanted to present as a way to provide notice, that might be the simplest way to do it, is that when a property is listed to sell, then the landlord has to provide notice, like within 5 days, that a listing agreement has been signed. That might be the easiest way, as far as timing is concerned, to be able to communicate it. And then at that point, the spirit of the law could say the landlord should provide the following information to the tenant when that notice is given. And so that can certain, and it can be very simple what those terms and elements are, but as far as reminding them of their rights within their lease or within the ultra. But the challenge will be as far as getting it applied. And so I do think, yes, I agree with you, Councilperson Sora, that that's a good thing. The challenge is just how to accomplish it.
Gotcha. Thank you for that perspective. I'm looking to see who else has hands raised. Mr. Oldham.
Thanks, Berkeley. A couple questions or concerns come to mind on how this could be enforced, and I want to kind of wrap this all around. My understanding, based on what I've been hearing, the main concern I think everyone has is if a tenant, the main reason people leave is because their cost of ownership goes up or cost of renting goes up, right? So I think, taking a step back, you guys addressed that through the notice provisions in your prior legislation. So I just want to keep that as a backdrop. And also, there's going to be a lot of, we fail a lot. Like, people get hired and we list properties. An owner wants a number that just the market won't bear. And there's a lot of failed transactions. And we get hired and then we don't market a property oftentimes because the debt markets change or property taxes go up or whatever the issue is. And so I want to, talk about the listing, the point of listing being an issue versus the point of sale or the point of agreement. Those are two distinct things. Because when we get hired to list a property, generally we market it for 30 to 45 days. The seller picks a buyer. that buyer does diligence for 30 days, and they may close, especially the large pension funds and insurance companies who own a lot of these big buildings. I mean, they're largely owned by state pension funds and big city pension funds. They'll close 10 days after their due diligence is expired. And so we're now asking both buyer and seller to potentially delay a transaction by months, which I would, defer to the attorneys on the call on what issues that potentially raises in terms of the market risk. A lot of these transactions happen, and like a lot of us may have refinanced our houses if we own houses because the rates are so low. Well, that helps commercial transactions. It drives up values, and if rates go back up and you're waiting for 90 days and the debt markets change, then the transaction's at risk. And so, is there potential, are there issues there, that we're creating that aren't necessary? And to what I previously said, I think we've done a pretty good job addressing the rent increase notification, and that ultimately is what I think it boils down to.
Thank you. That and or just plain have it believe, which is the other issue that's been identified. So I appreciate that. I'm looking for hands.
Councilmember Allen.
Is that Kelly Bailey?
Yes, and I'm so sorry, but I don't have the option to raise my hand. So
okay. Thank you for speaking up. You recognize us.
So I can just be added to the list, or I can go ahead, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, you can go ahead and talk.
And I'm sorry, I've been trying to raise my hand, and I'm not sure what's wrong. I'm a little illiterate when it comes to these words.
We're all learning.
And I'm doing so I think there have been a lot of really good points raised here, but I think we need to focus on the issue that we're trying to resolve versus the outcome of the legislation should it be implemented as it's drafted, even the amendment. So I think the legislation, and I've had a lot of good conversations with Councilmember Taylor, and just to be abundantly clear, I represent the Greater Nashville Apartment Association, and they're just philosophically opposed for a number of reasons that I've shared with council and with this committee a number of times, being required to give notice of sale. What they're also philosophically opposed to, though, is bad actor landlords who either illegally or in contradiction to the lease agreement and contractual obligations do things like terminate tenancy, increase rent. And so I think that the legislation is at least was drafted under the assumption that transfer of ownership results in termination. Well, I don't have the actual data in front of me. I have confirmed with the number of management owners who are members of the apartment association that, in fact, as it relates to multifamily, that is very seldom the case. There is almost always a seamless transition of ownership where tenants don't even realize the owner of the property, sometimes a conglomerate of multiple principals. Tenants don't even realize that ownership, oftentimes, because finances tend to be a factor in sale, there will be improvements made to the property. So I think we have to keep very distinct buckets here. We've addressed increase in rate and rents with councilmember legislation. If we're talking about just requiring notice of sale or potential sale or listing of sale or anything thereof, my question is why? And if the answer is because it results in unlawful termination of tenancy, well, I drafted a bill to address that. And that bill includes education concerns that landlords will have responsibility for. That legislation included a penalty of $50 for landlords identified. And so much to Russ's point, the object or the objective of multifamily is to maintain tenancy and occupancy. And so is the objective of a transfer of ownership of multifamily, turn around and evict. So I think if we're, and it explains to me a number of times is block termination of tenancy, then we should absolutely 100% work on that, and the Greater National Apartment Association would help lead the way on that, just as we work with Council Member 2 on the next issue. Another point that was made by Mr. Trussell, I believe, was, those who are currently abiding by state law, Tennessee entertained outlines termination notice requirements for periodic tenancies. Those who are, and then aside from that, always at least in the landlord or in the professional management, property management industry, there are lease provisions that are even more punitive than even the Tennessee Code. So if you have a landlord, a bad actor landlord, currently adhering to what is state law, or who's operating outside the provision of their contractual obligations outlined in the lease, implementing this is not going to change that behavior. Rather, it's going to create additional hurdles that significantly impact a very negative way. And oftentimes, if you're attempting to sell a property as a financial reason, and something like a 90-day notice requirement causes that sale to fall through, it's with an owner who is financially able, or a group of owners who aren't financially able to maintain and upkeep the property as they should. So I have shared with council a number of technical and legal challenges that this creates in terms of foreclosures, notice requirements, closing documents, things of that nature, and obviously Mr. Parker did a much better job of highlighting some of that. But in addition to that, I think from a practical standpoint, when you look at how this is going to affect the tenant, you're going to have just an influx of notice that creates unnecessary confusion. You're going to scare some tenants into overreacting unnecessarily. It has the potential, the very likely potential, to bleed off tenants, affecting the overall health of the community. And then, quite frankly, I think as council members, you're going to see an increase in, at least at the district level council members, you're going to see an increase in concerned constituents who don't know if their property is selling or not, but they've been notified by the landlord who is attempting to be compliant with his law. So I will pause because I've said a lot. I'm just sorry I couldn't raise my hand along the way.
Thank you. I appreciate you waiting, and your some of your message was a little hard to hear, but I appreciate that information. And I have a couple of people who want to respond, and then I may make a suggestion for how to proceed forward. Councilmember Taylor and Councilmember Sawar, I see both of your hands up. Councilmember Taylor.
Yes, ma'am.
Ladies first.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Taylor. In listening, I do have a question for Mr. Odom, but it appears from everything that I'm listening to, the most pushback that I hear is from apartment complexes and complexes with so many tenants. And it's based on the assumption that, which is true, that when you're selling, you want to keep those tenants. That's the only way you can sell it. And so I want us to wait for the data on how many of these happen in those apartment complexes. If it's rampant, then we must go ahead. But if it's not, then I'm open to, if it's not happening there a lot, and it's going to create too much hardship, especially because there's too many tenants involved, then I'm okay with us excluding those type of properties. My thoughts, but I still do think we still need it for the two properties, the condo, the duplexes and the individual properties. I think maybe that's where a lot of it is happening, and I still think we should go ahead and do that. And notices in those cases, I don't think will be as cumbersome as for a property. But the question that I have for Mr. Oldham is this: in discussing this with some of the people in the real estate business, someone suggested we do it at the point of the listing, because then it gives everybody enough time. But I've also heard that the listing is not good because sometimes you list it, but you don't sell it. So let's do it at the points of agreement where we're about to actually go into a contract to sell. But then the argument, again, from the realtor side is that, when we do it at that time, sometimes we need to close really fast, and we don't have that much to wait. So what is the, I mean, we've got to be able to pick a point here. And so if notice is not too certain, but closing may be too short, how do we achieve this from all of you that are in the real estate business? Because we do agree that we need to give notices, whether it's to the small business, individual properties. So I just want your take on that as we're looking into refining the bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Suara. I think we've kind of reached our time, and I want to be cognizant of that. And I think that's where Councilmember Allen was headed to in her next statement. The one thing I do have some numbers for you all, and these are just very raw data. 1 unit detached structures in Davidson County, 52.2% of renters or of individuals in Davidson County, over 50% of our population rents homes that are 1 unit detached structure, and then 13.7% are in larger complexes, 20 or more unit structures. And so those are a few data points that that I wanted to share. In some instances, for instance, in District 33, it's a whopping 89.1% of individuals that rent their homes total. So those are some numbers that I do have that I was able to find during this conversation. I do want to lead it here. I believe that Councilmember Suara had a good point. Is where do we go when everything seems to be a concern? And it's a great bill, but yet everything we have is concern. So where do we go from here is the question. And I think that one of the goals that I've talked to several of you, or at least a representative from the organization before, if you are loving this thing or if you hate it. But I've had a chance to kind of hear from you, and one of the themes that I hear is that this is a bill that's needed. This is legislation that we would like to see because we all want to protect over 50% of Nashvillians, right? Over 50% of Nashvillians are renting property. And so that means that over 50% of Nashvillians at any given time can have their property sold, their leases up, or their month to month, or their week to week, and that their property then will be sold, and they're leaving. The issue for me isn't right now. Ms. Lane Bailey hit the nail on the head with a conversation and legislation in regards to a wrongful tenant, a wrongful termination. But that's not what this is. We could do that as well. I think we can. I would be happy to, and I probably will introduce that. But that's not what we're doing here. What we're doing is, prior to a new owner takes ownership of that property, we want to share a notice with the tenant. Again, we're not asking you guys what we're going to say or what you're say. I mean, you could say, hey, we're thinking about selling this property. You're going to be able to stay here for the same exact rent. Nothing's going to change much. It's just we got to get out of it. I mean, and we can't tell you what to say, but we can ask you if this moves forward to have a timely notice. And is 90 days that amount? To be quite honest, right now, I don't think so. I think we can cut those days down just a little bit, and I've already been working to amend that portion of this bill. And then, but yet to add a notice is the intent to keep moving forward. And I think sometimes we get a little hairy, and if we just look at black and white and try to stay out of the gray areas, the intent of this is to provide notice to the tenant that the property will be sold, or that the property may be sold, right? And so we're not trying to tell you how. We're not trying to scare people off. We don't want to scare people out of Nashville. I think stability is a goal for all of us as we move through some of the trying times. Not just the pandemic and the tornado, but as I think we hit on it. We just had a property tax increase. So we have some trying times that this city is going through. And I think that there's some opportunities for us to add in some protections for over 50%. Again, over 50% of Nashvillians. And so that's the intent for this, is to provide notice and keep those folks safe.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. It is well past 6, so I appreciate you, everyone, sticking with us and having a good conversation. Clearly, it's a complex issue, and there are several different types of protection that are important to tenants. We have, as we've said, we've dealt with the raising of rent. This, according to Mr. Taylor, is focused on the notification of sale. What I've heard is that we need a notification of non-renewal of lease, and that's something I'll pursue maybe separately if that's not where this bill is going, because that sounds like the issue that leaves people having to change schools or be farther away from their jobs, and I hope that we can deal with that one as well. So I would suggest, just from a procedural standpoint, my guess is that several of us have ideas for amendments, and that we would direct those through Mr. Cooper and Ms. Zeitlin. And this comes back again the first meeting in September. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The first Tuesday in September.
So there's ample time to get amendments in. And if we feel like it is helpful to have another called meeting or to have this as part of the agenda at the Affordable Housing Committee meeting next Monday, then that would offer us another opportunity to further discuss. And in addition, just to get folks thinking, I would also like to congratulate the 3 members of the council, including Councilmember Sepulveda, who were on the CARES Act committee that were able to get $10 million quickly allocated for rental assistance. And I think that is an issue that as a committee, we want to continue to focus on, perhaps advocating for additional funding for that at the state level. So that's a topic that I would like for everybody to get educated on in the future, and that may be something we speak about at our next meeting next Monday. I'm not sure if we have items on the agenda, but I will probably call a meeting just so we can sort of circle back around on this issue for that. So if there's no one that wants to speak further, I will ask people who have thoughts about amendments to direct those to Mr. Cooper and Ms. Zeitlin, and they can then pass those on to the sponsor to be offered as friendly amendments if you so choose that way. And that we will meet next Monday before the council meeting, and that might be an opportunity to just speak further, or if we need to call another meeting, we will do that. This is an important bill, and I appreciate all the discussion on it and the input from all the different viewpoints. So with that, I will adjourn this meeting. Thank you all.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.org.